saying, thank you for the introduction. And like she said, I'm going to be talking about teaching to empower and how to support junior engineers. So I'll tell you all a little story first. So basically, for the first 2 years, or for my first 2 years as a software developer, I did some really cool things. I built impactful features. One of my favorite ones was called Auto Translate. Um, and basically, that allowed or removed language barriers between our users and allowed them to speak in their native language. And they got to see a real time translation. I also worked to improve the code base by like doing database migrations, taking initiative to implement automated UI test plans, managing releases, bug bash sessions, all of that good stuff. And I also managed and mentored interns. Unfortunately, for those 2 years, I did not recognize any of the cool things that I was doing, and I felt very embarrassed most of the time. I felt incompetent, under pressure, full of anxiety, and I was often debating if I should quit. Like I was like, maybe I don't belong in tech. Um, I I think I'm a bad developer. Um, but I figured, this is the way it's supposed to be. Like, this is what being a junior developer is like. So maybe I just need to produce more work. So I would like stay up late and try really hard to get as much work done. I thought maybe I'm just not smart enough. So I enrolled in college to pursue a degree in computer science. And I just spent a lot of time trying to prove my worth to myself and my coworkers. And like I mentioned earlier, I just didn't recognize any of the awesome work I did. I didn't take time to acknowledge any of my progress. Unfortunately, my experience is not an isolated experience. I started talking to other junior developers, like from Twitter or from coding boot camps that I graduated from, or any other developer groups, and they seem to be having similar experiences where they were getting like negative reinforcement. So they thought they were bad and they decided they're just going to quit tech altogether. But I really don't think it should be that way. And my perspective started to shift when I experienced these three things. I started teaching people to code. I observed how my husband's developer team treated him. And I tried working at a different company and I saw, wait a minute, this is so much different than what I was experiencing before. I do want to note if there's any junior developers listening in, definitely, I love this tweet. Basically, it's saying like you might be able to survive in a toxic environment, but you cannot thrive in that environment. So definitely find a space for you to thrive. Don't try to stick it through. I personally don't think it's worth it. So when I changed my environment into a more positive environment, my confidence increased a little bit. I started to get a little bit more peace. And I got a better work life balance. That's still a work in progress for me. I also gained a more realistic awareness of my strengths and weaknesses. So I was no longer like, oh man, I suck at everything. I was just like, okay, I'm just not that great at this part, but I can get better. And here's where I'm actually good at. I also developed a passion for empowering junior engineers and helping them grow. Because of my experience, I thought, you know what, people shouldn't be experiencing this. And the fact that it's common is just like not okay. So I'm going to share those tips with you today. But before I do, I'll introduce myself a little bit further. My name is Rizel Scarlett. I'm a developer advocate at GitHub. I've been a software engineer for approximately 3 years, and I am the program director at Code House, which is an organization that's aimed at teaching women of color and non-binary people of color to code. I'm very passionate about empowering and educating others about technical topics, and I also have an addiction to Twitter. So on that note, go ahead and follow me on Twitter or Hashnode or dev.to or GitHub at Black Girl Bites. Hopefully soon I'll be on TikTok and YouTube and Twitch. I'm still getting used to the video format, so give me some time. All right, so every developer is a teacher, in my opinion. Maybe you don't think of yourself that way, but it's definitely either explicit in your job responsibility or implicit. So for people who it's explicit for is if you're like a boot camp founder or teacher at a boot camp or a mentor, your role is to teach, right? Or maybe you work at a school or a college and you're a professor, or you're in developer relations like me. The whole point of your job is to basically teach developers. But for other people who are like engineering managers, senior developers, mid-level developers, and even some junior developers, you may not realize it, but that's part of your job responsibility too. It may not say it in your job description, but you have to, or it's kind of like you have to help other junior engineers or less experienced engineers and help them grow so they can get to where you are. And I think a lot of people try to do that, but they're not empowering others as they teach. And to me, if you're not doing that, you're teaching poorly. So here's a couple lessons that I learned from those three perspective shifts that I talked about. The first one was in observing my husband's experience, right? So we both learned to code at the same time. We went to the same coding boot camp. So we had similar skill sets. But I was always curious, why does he feel happy at work? Why does he feel empowered? And he's not experiencing the same things as me. So when we moved in together, I started to kind of eavesdrop. And I was like, wow, this is how he gets treated at work. So here's a couple things that I learned from his manager and team: to listen as much as you speak with your junior developer. Maybe even listen more, right? Because as a mentor, you might feel excited to share all of your knowledge, but that could be super overwhelming for the junior developer, and you may be ignoring their actual needs. You might be like, oh, I want to help you with this, this, and this, but maybe that's not what they need. So listen to figure out what they want and need, and then also make support available to them. I noticed that for my husband, he had office hours, he had a designated mentor to help him answer any questions, and their job was to prioritize answering those questions and helping him. That made him feel safe. That made him feel like he can ask a question anytime. Unfortunately for me, I was in a situation where my developer or the other senior developers were busy. They were bogged down with a lot of work, so they didn't have time to deal with my questions. And it made me feel like I was incompetent or stupid for asking questions. So definitely create space or time for them to ask questions. And then also set clear goals and expectations. Most junior developers don't want to be junior forever, right? They want to know that they're not being stagnant. They want to reach different milestones. So make those clear. How can they get to the next step? Um, from what I noticed from my husband is his manager had a checklist of different things that would help him get from level 1 to level 2. And so he was able to reach that path. But for me, I kept asking my manager, how do I get from level 1 to level 2? And he was kind of like, I don't really know. So it kind of made me feel like I'm not going to get to move anywhere. And maybe I suck so bad that I can't get to the second level. Also, teaching at G-Code really put me in this position of now understanding how other senior developers feel. Sometimes teaching people to code can feel super frustrating, right? And scary, and you may feel like you have to have an ego. So the first thing I learned is about being vulnerable. I notice that tech is rooted in elitism and academia. We always pretend to know it all. It's kind of the norm to be like, oh, yeah, I already know that. But you have to be honest, you don't know everything. And I think by saying that, you reduce that pressure that new developers feel, that they like have to know everything. So at G Code, I always say, I don't know, let's Google it. And I encourage the other mentors to do the same. That way, the people that are learning to code aren't feeling like, oh my gosh, I have to pretend like I know or I can't ask questions. Also, don't ask if they've Googled it. I used to hate when people did this to me when I was an early career developer. And then I realized I started doing it to other people too. But I took a step back and I was like, why am I asking them this? Because I don't want them to rely on me only, of course. But obviously, they probably Googled it if they're coming to you. Asking for help takes a lot of like swallowing your pride. So instead, I try to lead them through like a more like a framework, a question framework. I've asked them like, what's your goal? Like, what are you trying to do? What have you already tried? And what did those results look like? That way, instead of just saying, have you Googled it? They are answering those questions. We're not wasting time. And in the future, they know to answer those questions. Like they get used to the pattern. They're like, hey, Rizel, here's what I'm at. Here's what I've tried. Here's what it looked like. The other thing I learned is that your teaching style may not be suitable for their learning style. Um, the way you want to teach is not always the way they learn best. And you kind of have to learn to adapt to their learning preferences and provide options for them to learn best. I know there's that tendency to want to teach how you learned or how you feel best, but I noticed that it doesn't work. At G-Code, sometimes I would make an analogy because that's the analogy that clicked at me. And then I would look at everyone's faces and it would be completely blank. So I realized, okay, some people need to learn by video. Some people need to learn by doing it together. Some people need applicable examples, and some people need a little bit more theoretical ones. So you have to learn to adapt to that. Also, for more formal teaching, here's like 3 quick tips. Using spaced repetition. It's a method that people use to review material at systematic intervals because our brains can't hold everything at once. So for this, I use Kahoot quizzes. Basically, every week we do like a little fun Kahoot quiz, and it's competitive and not scary in a way. And basically, I'll use some questions from like the first week and I'll sprinkle it in with questions from like the 7th week. That way, they'll try to remember new stuff and then get a reminder of some older concepts. I also gather feedback every week. This is part of listening more than you speak. You want to make sure you get an understanding of how the junior engineer is feeling and what you can do to make it better instead of just assuming how they feel. Also, gradually increase responsibility or learning. This works for both work and in a educational setting. I think sometimes people want to throw the junior developer in on the deep end too quickly. It's good to like maybe give them a small bug and then maybe give them like a bigger bug, but one that was related to the small bug. That way they start to be able to make those connections. If you want to learn a little bit more about teaching junior developers, I would suggest you follow Leon Noel. He teaches at 100 Devs, and he also taught me at Resilient Coders. April, she is the founder of Compassionate Coding, and then Becca, who also does virtualcoffee.io. All of these organizations specialize in supporting and mentoring more junior or early career developers. All right. Now, for one of the last things I learned was when I switched jobs and I worked in an environment where I believed I could thrive. One thing that my manager had me do was reflect between tasks. So basically, after completing a ticket, I would write a note or blog about what I learned. And this way, I retained what I learned. And I was like, wow, this is such a good practice. Why don't people do this more often? Rather than moving from one ticket to the next, and now you completely forgot what you learned and you don't even have a space or place to look back at it. Oftentimes I think we like put a lot of pressure on like we got to get this done, but we need to prioritize learning for junior developers. Also, introducing empathetic code reviews. I think a lot of times people or engineers like to be very blunt, but it's good to be thoughtful and kind and take time to read the code properly and provide thoughtful advice. Also, let the junior engineer know when your suggestions are blockers or nitpicks. That was one thing one of my teams did when I switched jobs. They were like, oh, this one can't go into production, so definitely change this. But this is a bit of a nitpick. You can still merge it, but just make sure for the future, this is a better way that you can do this. That way, the junior developer is not feeling super overwhelmed and not sure how to tackle each and every one of the feedback. And then on handling mistakes, this is one that I'm very passionate about. Avoid placing blame and help the junior engineer fix an issue when they make a mistake, especially if they indicate that they need help, right? Let them know it's okay and that you've made the mistake before, and just give them tips on how to avoid the mistake in the future. Because a lot of times the developers already beating up themselves for making a mistake, so you don't need to beat up on them even more. Also, know that it's leadership's fault or the team's fault. that they made a mistake, because there's not enough guardrails in place. Like if there was guardrails in place, they wouldn't have made that mistake. I don't know if anybody remembers, but back in June, HBO Max sent out this empty test email. And then at the end of it all, they said, oh, it was the intern and we're helping them through it. I personally don't think that's okay. Maybe that intern felt okay with it, but you never know how someone will react to it. And it wasn't the intern's fault. It was their fault, because the intern shouldn't have been able to do that. There should have been guardrails in place to avoid that. And then this is advice for any companies or engineering leaders or hiring managers who are listening. If you want to make this space a good place for junior engineers, start thinking about your culture. Give positive reinforcement to early career devs, more senior devs, everyone. Create that culture of giving positive reinforcement and telling them, here's where you're doing good, because that will encourage people to want to do even better. They're like, wow, my manager believes in me. They like me. They like what I'm doing. I'm going to go even harder, and genuinely highlight their achievements, even if it's something that's small to you. Maybe you already have accomplished that a million times before, but this is a junior developer's first time doing that. So let them know that they're doing a good job. Also, in hiring, I think people have a tendency to ignore arrogance or big egos because of intelligence. Because you're like, okay, our main goal is making sure we have a great code base. But will it really be a great code base if the other developers around them, especially junior engineers, aren't feeling psychological safety? And you want to make sure you're hiring developers who are humble and would advocate for other mistreated members on your team. And then think about process, right? I think Scrum and Kanban or Kanban, I don't know how to say it, but those processes keep engineers focused on completing tickets. But and while that's good, right? We want to be moving forward. We want to get tickets done. It's not always encouraging them to help each other, because they're like, I gotta get this done. I can't be chatting with you. We are on a new sprint. I gotta get this done before the day is over, so that I'm not going over my story point time. But start thinking of methods to prioritize helping each other on your team while still making progress on your code base or product or whatever. And then also write clear tickets and documentation so that your junior developer can start working confidently. I think a lot of times I've sat down and I read a ticket and I've been like, I have no clue what they want me to do. And because this environment is scary, I don't want to ask. So now you're because you didn't take that time to write out a well thought out ticket, you're losing time on my own engineering work, because I sat here for an hour trying to figure out what's going on. That is essentially the end of my talk. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for listening. And continue to make the world a better place for early career developers. If you have any questions, I am happy to answer.
Thanks so much, Rizel. That was awesome. I think you had some really great advice in there.
Thank you.
This is such an important topic, I think, giving and getting support when you're a junior engineer. I mean, I think that's why so many women leave, because they don't get the support that they need right out the gate. So it's pretty terrible.
Yeah, I agree. I heard they like only stay for like 10 years or so, or less, or something like that. So
yeah. So if anybody has any questions, let us know. Rizel's here and willing to answer. I just want to call out a couple things. I wrote some notes as you were talking because I just thought you made some really great points. But I have a question for you. Mm-hmm. I've worked with some engineers who set aside a very specific block of time for their junior devs to ask them questions, like every Tuesday and Thursday from 2 to 3. What are your thoughts? I have mixed feelings about that personally. I'm curious what you think about that.
I think personally, I think that's a good option, because now they know that this is a specific time that's dedicated to them and they can answer questions. I'm curious, what are maybe I'm not seeing the negatives. What are the points that you're seeing? Because you're more experienced than me.
I think I think it's a good practice to have a designated time, but I think it has to be very well thought out and very well planned, because if the time between, we'll call it asking sessions, is too far, I think people can become very frustrated and
Mm,
then spiral into, we all get into that swirl of, I don't know what I'm doing, and it just gets worse and worse.
yeah, yeah. That's a good point. I didn't think about that. Yeah, I do think um maybe if ahead of time they kind of plan out like here's what we're going to be chatting about today, or the junior developer messages them, and then there's still more time to be able to answer questions, not just that 2 to 3 time, like still letting them know you can ask questions outside of that.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's a fine line between, um, you don't want people coming to you every 5 minutes. You want to give them ample time, like do some research, dig in, see what you're learning, but also not too much time that the frustration just builds up and they're just really losing focus and beating themselves up, quite frankly.
Yeah, yeah. Let me see. Rizel, I'm curious if you have advice for encouraging junior devs to ask for help early and often. I think my advice would just be showing yourself asking questions too. Like if you, I know it's a little bit hard now that we're remote, but if you show or if your team has that culture of they're asking questions, I think a junior developer will be like, okay, this is something that everybody does. We're all asking questions. That would be my advice. What are some tips? Oh, I'm not sure if you're supposed to read them or me. Sorry if I'm taking
Whatever's
too long.
easiest for you. I'm
Okay,
here to help you.
okay, I don't mind reading them. Okay, I was like, I don't know if I'm taking her job. Um, what are some tips to encourage your junior engineers to ask for help? I have worked with some engineers who might be blocked for days, but don't ask for help unless someone offers first. Yeah, I would say similarly, create that environment, and then I think you, at least to start, might have to start like reaching out to them first. Because I think when you're new at any job, you don't want to seem like you don't know what you're doing. So you might have to like schedule regular or more often one-on-ones with them, or like tell them, hey, I'm gonna check in with you every afternoon at 1 p.m. or something like that. At least for me, I think that would work a little bit. Um, and to like say, hey, if you want to peer, I'm happy to peer with you. Or here's what I'm working on. Maybe show them yourself also kind of pairing on something with them, and then flip it around. Be like, okay, now it's time for us to pair together. That way you help them move forward.
That's great advice. Do you? Oh, we got another one.
What are you gonna? Oh, okay.
I'll hold my question while they keep popping in.
Okay. How do you help junior devs with soft skills? That's a good question. Uh I don't even know if I know the answer. I think at soft skills is so broad. I want to know what particular soft skill. And maybe you'll be able to help me answer that too. Because I'm like I could ramble about this for a long time. Let me see. How can I answer this? I think I would say one thing I'm thinking of is not only having them code all day, right? Like maybe carve out some time in the month or the week or whatever for them to like attend workshops or like sessions that help with like soft skills. That way it's not just this focus on coding, because being a software engineer is more than coding, it's communication, which I think you're suggesting here. So also like carve out time or give them resources and tell them, hey, at on Tuesday at 1 or whatever, let's go through this communication uh, course or something like that.
Oh, that's a good point, because I think too often we focus just on like the development. Like, here I am, I'm going to help you become a better developer, and you're going to build all these skills. But then at the end of the day, you don't know, like, well, what's the best way to communicate with other departments? How do I translate a very technical topic into something less technical so that I can get my point across and show that I know what I'm talking about without people think I'm talking above them or below them.
Yeah. And I feel like conferences are a great, well, one of the ways I kind of learned to do that. So like sponsoring them, being like, hey, go to this once a year and, you know, get that well-rounded developer experience.
Yeah, for sure. I love going to conferences. I'll be so excited when conferences come back in person for real.
Me too.
They're awesome.
Me too. What are your thoughts on micromanagement for junior devs to help them? Some devs feel it's overwhelming, others want hourly check-ins. I think that's where you kind of have to listen more than you speak and figure out what your junior developer needs. And I had seen this talk once. I don't know if I'm going to be summarizing this correctly, but basically this one lady was saying how her manager asks, like, what do you need from me? How often do you want me to check in on you? What will help you to progress? And like be very clear about like where your skills are at and where you want them to be or something like that. So I think that would help, because I personally, I don't know if I like people checking in on me that often. I want some time to be able to figure it out on my own, but I know some people would want like more often check-in. So it's a case by case basis.
Yeah. So kind of like set a baseline. Like,
Yeah.
here's what I want. Let's see if we can do it that way. Because I agree. If you have somebody checking in too often, you're like, I immediately go to like, what am I doing wrong that you're checking in with me so often?
Yup, me too. I'm like, wait a minute.
Yeah, but at the same time, don't leave me on an island. I don't want to be alone forever.
Exactly. It's a hard balance.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So much of this is, isn't it?
What is the general definition of junior devs, though? Does it mean people who have 1 to 2 years of experience? Good question. Yeah, I've seen it vary. I've seen some people consider junior devs as someone who just graduated, and some people say, oh, no, that's entry level. And then I've seen some people say that's someone who's had about two years or so. When I'm saying this, I guess I'm talking about all. Like my presentation was about people who are just learning, who just got in, and then who are like have like less than 2 years or so.
Yeah, I also think putting a time frame on it is hard too, because we all learn at different paces. So
True.
maybe somebody is a little bit more junior after even maybe 3 years than other people are at 1. So
that's true, and that's okay.
it is okay. It's perfectly okay. We all learn at a different pace and do things on our own time. So
Yeah,
it's 100% okay.
that was a good call out. Thank you.
But I think for all the junior people out there, they feel like, oh, I've been in the industry for 2 years. Like I have to know so much and I have to be doing so much. And I don't think that's true either. You just have to keep learning and keep on keeping on, and it's all good.
Yeah, as long as you're progressing, you're doing amazing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Right. Do you have any more questions out there? I have one while we're see if we have any more jump up. Do you have any tips on how to make pair programming less scary? I think pair programming is kind of scary probably for most of us, even no matter how long you've been in the industry. But man, when you're just starting out and you have this senior dev who's been in the industry for 10 plus years, be like, show me what you're doing and let's pair. I know I'm like, ugh.
Okay, I thought I was the only one. I hate programming. I've always been like, oh, I don't want to pair program. But sorry. For me, I think what can help, or how I feel more comfortable, is if they let me work on it on my own first, at least for a couple. At least I just don't like when it's something like the problem is new and I've never seen it. And then they're like, okay, start coding. I'm like, whoa, I don't know what to So introduce them to the problem, let them work through it on their own a little bit, and then pair with them and ask them what they've got, like not what they've gotten done so far, but like be like, okay, so you what have you understood from it and stuff like that, and then help them a little bit, like guide them a little bit. But you don't have to be, I think when you start off, you don't have to be like staring at them code and then every time they like do a typo, you're like, no, that's not function. I hate when people do that. I'm like, I'm terrified now.
I hate when people do that as well.
My company is switching to being stricter about completing work within sprint. Today, one of my juniors communicated that she was concerned about asking for help because I had my own work to do. How could I help encourage my team and managers to make space for asking for help within our stricter system? Ooh, that's a good question.
Mhm.
I don't know if this is something I really thought about too in depth. I don't know. From my experience, I would just be honest and be like, "Hey, um, I'm trying to think. Yeah, I will be honest that right now, me answering this, I don't have that much experience with this, but I would also just straight up tell my boss, like, hey, I don't think we're creating an inclusive experience or like a psychologically safe experience. Could we like give me and the junior developer a little bit of extra time? That way I have enough time to mentor them and they have enough time to work on stuff. Like I know sometimes people at some of my old jobs would like say, okay, this sprint we're gonna complete like half of the points because we're working on other stuff that are not just technical, and the team would agree to that. I don't know. Maybe you have a better suggestion on that. I'm not really too sure.
Well, I like what you said there. I think just being upfront about it. I'm probably a more blunt person, so I would just probably wouldn't hesitate to speak up and say something about it. But it is hard, especially if they're really generally the people making those rules to be more strict about points and what you get completed when don't really understand how the work gets done anyway. So that's kind of a barrier already.
Yeah.
But I think being vocal about it in a very respectful and nice manner is really that's my approach to it.
Yeah. I'm like, that's all you can do. I'll try to think of other things,
Yeah.
but I don't know.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard. And I know I get in that swirl too where I'm like, we're all so busy. I don't want to ask somebody for help on this, but you just have to because then you waste more time not asking for help. Yeah.
Exactly. Here's experience. Does time in boot camp count if you worked on real world projects while there? Um, I would make it count. I would put it on my resume. I guess it depends on what you mean by real world projects. I think a lot of times people in boot camps kind of do all the same projects. It just ends up being that way. But if they put you in like apprenticeships or like on like some kind of process where you're working on a team, I would try to spin it and say, yes, I have had experience doing this, this, and that. And I'd just be transparent. That's how I like to be. I like to be transparent, be like, this is what I did, here's how it worked. And I don't know if I like you were saying before, years of experience, I think we put too much emphasis on that in the industry.
Yeah. I would agree with you there for sure.
Yeah. How much should I try to learn before it's realistic that I land my first job? I'm finding it difficult to know how much to conquer when looking at job descriptions for entry level devs that ask for what seems like way more than entry level knowledge. I agree that a lot of job descriptions these days are like, you need to know React, this, that. But keep in mind that a lot of the times that the people who are writing job descriptions, they're not developers. So they might be HR or whatever. They're just writing out a wish list based on what the hiring manager said, and maybe they don't have that much context. So I would start applying now. Start in like even if you don't do well on the interview, that's practice for you. Now you know what to expect and where to go, and just keep applying, just keep practicing as well. I know people do LeetCode or Hacker Rank to practice for interviews. Because if you're starting to figure out or think about, is this time for me to land my first job? I would say it's time. And I think the interviews will help you to realize where your gaps are. This is so fun.
Yeah.
What question?
When you're mentoring people, do you how do you advise them on things like going on interviews? Like, do you think it is a good practice to interview frequently and often just to learn what people are going to ask and build their skills up?
I do. I don't know, maybe some people disagree with me, but I personally do it for myself. So I do tell people, just going with it to the interview. I don't I don't want to set them up for failure, of course, but I'm like, go in here and take this as practice. If it comes out with a good result, or like that you get to move to the next step, that's good. But if you don't get to the next step, that's okay, because it's still good, because you still got a chance to learn what the interview experience is going to be like and where you may need to improve your skills, and just keep practicing from there. I also tell them start with like companies that you don't want as much. That way, by the time you get to the company you want, you're top notch.
Yeah. Then if you don't move on, it's not really that you're just like, I didn't
Yeah,
want it anyway.
yeah.
I used to work with a girl who would just go on interviews for practice. She wasn't even looking for a job. And she's like, I haven't been on one for 2 months. I'm just going to go interview somewhere for practice. I was like, fine.
I would like to do that in theory, but I don't have the time. That's exhausting. Nonprofit work related to tech would be good to highlight. Yeah, I agree. Anything you can use, even if you like. When I first got into tech, I used like a lot of my customer service experience. Anything, I was like, yeah, I'm great at communicating. I can do this. Anything from your past, definitely use that. That's great advice. I didn't know what I don't know until I failed my interview. Exactly. Me too.
I'm going to call something out though. You did not fail your interview.
True.
You just did not make it to the next round. There's no failing in interviewing, in my opinion. I'm sorry. I'm putting my opinions in there, but
no, I didn't even really think of it that way. Yes, you didn't fail. I love that. How has your mentorship style changed with remote work? Oh, that is a good question. Because when G-Code was in person, it was very easy to see their faces. Now, when their cameras are off and all that, I'm like, I don't even know if you guys understand what's going on. But I think I've just, what have I done? I think one thing I've used is Fist of 5, even though I can't really see them. I ask them to type in the chat from a scale of like 0 to 5, how much they understood it. I do a lot more check-ins, and I try to like in a not scary way, ask them to like repeat what they learned or understood for me, because I can't rely on body language anymore. So I kind of have to have them express more of how they're feeling. Sometimes the best thing that didn't happen. Yeah, I agree with that with interviews. Sometimes when you didn't get the job or move to the next step, it's a godsend. that place might have been so toxic. So just think of it as a win.
that is so true.
Was there a question about all the orgs? Oh, there was a question about all the orgs you mentioned. Can you share them again? Oh, yes. I think there was 100 devs. That's basically a free online coding bootcamp run by Leon Noel. There's, what was the other one? Let me just double check. Compassionate Coders. I think I'm saying that right. I have a bad memory. Give me a couple seconds. Okay, found it. Compassionate Coding, and then there's virtualcoffee.io. I can share my slides. Maybe I can share my slides with y'all.
Yeah, I'm not sure how we go about sharing slides. This is also being recorded too, so after the conference is over, it'll be available.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep, there we go. Link in the YouTube. There we go.
Great. Yep. Do you mentor employees of various ages in your organization? Yeah. So, at G-Code, the age range is from 18 to 30. But I try to make it be like, because I'm 26, so I try to make it be like, I'm your friend, not like this overarching teacher. How do you deal with the rejection when it was your dream job or very close? Yeah, that's really tough. That's happened to me. Um, I I think that like before, sometimes I'm like, maybe this wasn't the job that I thought it was. Because if it was, they would have liked me and saw how amazing I was. And sometimes I just try again. Like after a year or something like that, maybe I'm like, okay, I wasn't at the level that they needed me to be at when I first interviewed, but next year I will be. I've applied to GitHub many times, and they've never taken me until now.
Uh,
Did you experience to mentor someone, or I guess they're saying like, what was my experience mentoring someone who's older than me? Um, that's a good question. Um, I I thought it was fine because, like I said, I try to make it be like I'm your friend and not your teacher. I don't want it to be like I'm in charge. I'm like this is a collaborative experience, and I'm just sharing like my advice with them, and maybe I have something to learn from them as well, whether they're younger than me or older.
yeah, that's a good point.
It's really tough getting the first tech job without experience. What's your advice? Yeah, and it seems very tough these couple years, like 2020, 2021. I think because of like the great resignation where all the seniors are moving to different companies. Now juniors are not, I mean, not juniors. Now companies are not prioritizing early career developers. I would say, um, I think continuing to practice and build, and then also try to make it known that you're practicing and building. So like use Twitter or blog a lot because you want to stand out. I think one of the problems that early career developers have is like after a coding boot camp or after college, they all have very similar projects or very similar experience. So when a hiring manager sees your resume, they're like, this is just like the other one. So build something and write about it, even if you're just writing about HTML. Like a lot of people are always so scared to blog because they're like, I don't have anything to share. Write about HTML. And that way you'll have a way to like stand out a little bit and a manager will see like your thinking process. And networking too. Networking helps.
That's great advice. Well, we are at the end of our time. So,
Okay.
Rizel, I want to thank you again. Your talk was fantastic. Thank you for this chat session, too. This was great. We truly enjoyed having you. Thank you for spending your time with us tonight.
Thank you for having me. Bye.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.